Welcome to the latest iteration of our monthly Asia briefing breakfast session. For those who have been before, you will know we take a quick hour in the morning to do a deep dive on some current hot issue affecting the part of the world that we cover. We do it with a great guest, or in the case of today, assuming the phones work out, two great guests. And we do it without podiums and panels and long speeches and the like. We're delighted today to have a double-barreled approach in Ambassador Winston Lord, who's here in the room with us, and Orville Schell on the line, again, hopefully from Beijing. Orville, by the way, is covering the Trump trip to Asia for Vanity Fair. Orville has a long career before this one in journalism, and he and the whole entourage with the president and the press team have just arrived in Beijing. Just a couple of words about coming events at the Asia Society. Before we begin, those of you who want to make it a double header in this building can come back tonight. We will have the author Xiaolu Guo in conversation with our senior fellow at the U.S.-China Center, Isaac Stonefish. Guo's new book is about how Chinese families have been coping with the changes in China now, and then also how they coped going back generations through the Cultural Revolution. That's tonight. A week from today, Orville will be back, and we'll have a full program sort of picking up where I guess today leaves off on the President's visit to China. Reflections on that with Orville, Bonnie Glazer, Danny Russell, our diplomat in residence, and Susie Jakes, the editor of our China File website. And lastly, our show After Darkness, Southeast Asian Art in the Wake of History, is on view in the galleries, getting lots of rave reviews. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, I see Jackie Meyer, who helps run these things for us, Wednesdays at 12:30, if you need a little zen in your life, we have half-hour professionally guided meditation sessions that are open to the public, free to members, and very inexpensive for everyone else. So we welcome you to all that. To this morning's program, we're marking two anniversaries in a way. 1 year ago, we had the election, of course, here of President Trump. And almost exactly 5 years ago, the investiture of Xi Jinping as president in China. And in the news at the moment, we are, as I've said, in the midst of the president's long tour in Asia, his first trip of that kind, or as he puts it now, the Indo-Pacific region. We may dig into what that phrase means. And of course, we've just seen the conclusion of the Party Congress in China, at which President Xi has been accruing even more accolades and titles and authority, I suppose, than he already had. It's a moment that some observers are painting as a kind of global transition moment or tipping point in terms of leadership on the global stage, with the U.S. described in various forms of retreat and China headed in the other direction. We may dig into that as well. Our guest this morning, and I've gotten a thumbs up, so, well, let me try. Orville Schell, can you hear us? Let's try again. Maybe he can hear us and we can't hear him. All of you who are frequent visitors here will know that Orville is head of our U.S.-China Center and one of the great scholars, authors, and as I said before that, a journalist, dean of the School of Journalism at Berkeley, and on the Trump trip. Winston Lord, it is just wonderful to have you back here. And when we speak, by the way, about anniversaries, 45 years ago, I've been boring Winston with stories about my read of this, which if you haven't read it is great, the Nixon and Mao book. It's several years old. But Winston Lord was on the trip, that landmark, groundbreaking trip that the president made to China. Winston Lord was on the trip a year prior that was then secret with Henry Kissinger. And Dr. Kissinger favored Winston Lord, this young superstar diplomat, to the point where he froze Secretary of State Rogers out of a lot of meetings, and then one of the many great nuggets in this book insisted to the Chinese that the photos, because there were President Nixon, Henry Kissinger, and Winston Lord, and asked the Chinese to please leave Winston Lord out of any of the communications and the photos, because that might prove too embarrassing back at the State Department. Winston Lord went on to serve as President of the Council on Foreign Relations, Ambassador to China, Assistant Secretary of State, and many other high-level positions. He will open with some brief reflections of his own, both about the trip that the President is on and the just concluded Party Congress. We'll come to Orville then, and then to your questions. And again, these sessions we do are meant for as much engagement as you're all in the mood for in the room. So we'll look forward to your thoughts and questions. And for those watching the live stream, you can send your questions by email to moderator@asiasociety.org or tweet questions using the hashtag AsiaSocietyLive. Ambassador Lord, welcome back to the Asia Society.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be back. Should we check whether Orville is listening or not? If he is, he can correct everything I say. But are you on, Orville?
Well, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Great to hear your voice.
Okay, I'll speak
in
brushstrokes, New York speed, because we want not long opening statements. By the way, some of the people standing there are welcome to fill these seats. You don't have to stand up.
I should have said that. There are plenty of seats here. Please join us.
Tom mentioned the anniversaries. Clearly, the current contrast between the strength of Xi, including with the Party Congress, and the problems that Trump faces, even last night in elections, not to mention other problems, does suggest to many an inflection point. We'll come back to that in the discussion. I don't think it is an inflection point. I think it can be if we don't get our act together, but we'll get back to that. Very briefly on the Party Congress, usually Chinese politics are very opaque. There's a Belgian scholar who said looking at Chinese politics is looking at unscripted provisions written with invisible ink on a blank page. Actually, in the case of this Party Congress, I think the outcome's pretty clear, with a few questions. Very briefly, you have Xi, of course, more dominant than ever. You have the Party Congress, Communist Party, going to be involved in everything. You have clear signs of more repression at home and more assertiveness overseas, including now holding China up as a model as opposed to the chaotic democracies. The only question, it seems to me, how is he going to handle the succession? He didn't appoint anybody that a likely successor, but this could be so he isn't a lame duck, so that he can have people compete for loyalty and looking competent and see who should be chosen. So I think he wants to go beyond another 5 years, but will he do it de facto or de jure behind the scenes? It remains to be seen. I think the economic dimension is a little uncertain. Is he serious about reforms and getting at issues like debt and overcapacity and so on? There is a pregnant line in there about no longer just worrying about, in effect, growth and the poor rising up, and better quality of life and more equal distribution. The jury's out on that. I think the Taiwan part is somewhat ambiguous. All in all, I think it adds up to a significant challenge to the United States and a much more ambitious Chinese role, and no longer Deng Xiaoping, hide your abilities and lay low. But we'll come back to that. Let me go to the trip and hear your experts on the phone. I urge everyone to read Orville Schell's epistles from Asia. There's 3 so far. You can get them on China File. They're terrific in substance and style. And I must say, I think independently before I read them, but reinforced, we have some of the same impressions of the trip so far. I would sum up the trip so far as so good. I think it's a repair mission, because I think our Asian and China policy was in serious disarray and may still be before he went on this trip. I think Trump, for the first 9 months of his presidency, roughly, has been doing a good job of making China great again. For a variety of reasons. Again, I have to be very brief here. Pulling out of the TPP, his protectionist instincts generally, being tougher on allies than he is on dictators, and sucking up to Xi, and while being tough on the trade imbalances and other aspects of paying for our troops and so on among our allies. With respect to China, this extravagant praise of Xi, flip-flopping on Taiwan, backing away from his economic pressures, at least temporarily, accepting Chinese actions on North Korea being more decisive than they really are. And then more generally, his America First policy, leaving the field to China, whether it's climate or trade policy or many other issues. The fact that his foreign policy is essentially military only, and he, with his trade disruption and total inattention to human rights and democracy promotion and soft power and gutting the State Department, hurting our foreign policy generally, and then what Trump has been doing at home in terms of division, fake news, fake statements, attack on our institutions, and making America white again. All of this weakens our posture, not to mention the Russian issues and his general unpopularity. So starting out on this trip, whether it's the general posture of Trump internationally and domestically or whether it's specific Asian policies, I think we were in serious difficulty. But so far, the trip is at least temporarily correcting some of this, I'm happy to say. First, the good news, I think just going for 12 days to Asia does show our commitment to the region on top of the other cabinet members and the vice president going. I'm glad to see now that Trump has agreed to attend the East Asia Summit at the end of his trip. It would have been a disaster if he walked away from that. I think the trip was set up nicely by Tillerson giving this Indo-Pacific speech, which suggests that we see India as part of the Asian scene, an important one. And the subtext is India, Australia, Japan, Korea, the United States. We want to get along well with China, but we can do it against a backdrop of strong alliances. And then the fact going to the allies first, the notes he's been striking, the pretty good chemistry, including reinforcing good chemistry with Abe and improving it with Moon so far, I think has been very helpful backdrop to his trip to China, which is now taking place. I think the Japan trip, I can't go into detail because I want to get through this, and the Korean trips have gone rather well. The Korean speech rightly highlighted the human rights as well as the nuclear problem in North Korea, did contrast South Korea with North Korea, struck some of the right notes. Now we'll see what happens in China. I think it's pretty predictable. We could already see the tremendous pomp and ceremony that Xi is doing with the Forbidden City and Peking Opera and so on. This has been consistent for all the leaders of Asia. They know the best way to get Trump to do what you want is to flatter him, give him great pomp and ceremony, and they're certainly doing that. I suspect that what will happen in the next 36 hours is there'll be a lot of investment deals with the American businessmen who've come along, some smoke and mirrors and a little tougher language in North Korea, and Trump will declare it the greatest summit in the history of the world. Finally, we'll see how the rest of the trip plays out. Not only the immediate China stop, but what he says is an APEC speech, which will lay out his Asian policy generally, flesh out the Indo-Pacific idea, what he does when he gets to Southeast Asia about these maritime disputes, how he comes out on trade, and when he says there's progress being made with North Korea, I don't know what he's talking about, but maybe that'll play out. And then afterwards, I would watch to see whether there isn't a turn toward a tougher policy on China. Because in addition to shoring up the alliances, he's been hearing from all our allies about some of the challenges that China presents. Final point, that no matter how well this trip goes, and I hope it goes for the rest of it as well as it has so far, there are crippling elements in our policy for foreign policy in general and Asia in particular that are going to remain no matter how well this trip goes. First, it's America first and leaving the field of global leadership to the Chinese. Secondly, no use of any instrument except military, no soft power, messing up our trade relations, no promotion of democracy. And finally, the Trump personality and policies on the home front, which create division and further weaken our stance. Thank you.
Thank you, Winston Lord. And you described, and again, just to set the table a little bit, you've mentioned the countries the President has been to Japan and made a major speech in Korea, I guess about 12 hours ago now, our time, and has now arrived in Beijing. So Orville Schell, Winston described this as a repair mission, I think is the phrase you used. From your vantage point, and Orville is with the press plane going to all these stops, how is that going so far?
Well, I must say that it was with some trepidation that I set out, because I think from the vantage point of home, I mean, we see tremendous amount of divisiveness and bad blood, and our government incapable of working in a bipartisan way. And I think Trump's behavior often makes one wonder whether he is really capable of performing the kind of leadership function that Asia wants. And so when I arrived in Japan, it was with this kind of sense of concern that we might just see a replication of some of the sort of attitudes and tweeting and divisiveness that we're accustomed to back home. And I must say, I've been quite surprised. The president has acted in a very dignified way, and partially that's because in the speeches that he has given, they've been quite good, as Winston has pointed out. They've been well sculpted, and they've gone a long, long way to kind of reassuring our two major allies, which are, of course, Japan and Korea. And at the same time, he, I think, has done a very effective job in wooing both the Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, and the new president of Korea, Moon Jae-in. And what's interesting about the way, just watching him work, is here is a man who understands how to woo another leader, because he himself has a sort of inexhaustible hunger to be stroked, to be wooed, to be praised, to be, kind of courted. And I think this gives him a unique ability to understand exactly what it is that these allies that come from smaller countries and countries that are really dependent on the United States, what they need. And I think, to the surprise of myself and others who have been on this trip, he's done a pretty good job. Now, I think just one other thought. I think that, in a certain way, the American government, when it comes to this Asian trip, has gotten quite functional. They've sort of left the wooing of the big leader, in other words, the personal relationships, to Trump. And he goes off and he plays golf and he praises them, and he has Melania with him, and he has, Ivanka was in Japan, and Jared Kushner is there. And so that's sort of his job. But what seems to be happening, and I urge you all to kind of watch this, Winston alluded to it, but I think there is a kind of a new strategic sense of what America should do that's been formed within the White House. And it's much more decisive. I think it's going to involve a lot more pushback in relation to China, and a lot more reassurance of our allies. Now, that reassurance of the allies was a huge thing, because you remember he was criticizing them for not paying their way. He was all over the map. But since he's been in Japan and Korea, he's been very decisive, very emphatic, very dignified, hasn't wandered, and has given some quite excellent speeches. And sitting today in the National Assembly in Seoul, as he gave a speech to the Korean Assembly, I was thinking to myself, this is a speech that Obama could have given. It was, that sort of well-crafted and cogent. Now he gets to China. And what's kind of odd is that we have him, he's almost like the object of, he's sort of going in serial fashion to these three Asian leaders, all of whom want to cultivate him, and he wants to cultivate them. But there's, of course, no leader he needs to cultivate more ardently and effectively than Xi Jinping here in China. And that started today when he toured the Forbidden City, and they went to a restoration laboratory in the Forbidden City that restores pieces of art. And tomorrow they have the big grand ceremony in the Great Hall of the People, which is, of course, great indeed. It's the most Leviathan, elephantine structure in the world. calculated to overwhelm and to awe. And then he'll have a joint press conference tomorrow and a state banquet in the evening, and then he's off to Da Nang and Vietnam the next day. So it'll be very interesting to see, A, what's the wooing kind of situation between him and Xi? What can he get from Xi on North Korea? Because that's the area actually where the U.S. and China interest really does overlap. And Winston, interestingly enough, I was thinking today, flying from Seoul here to Beijing, that when you went with Kissinger and Nixon, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai had decided, as had Nixon and Kissinger, that Moscow was the problem. And that was the bonding agent between the U.S. and China in that great paradigm shift in 1972. I think Xi Jinping has not yet come to see Pyongyang as the modern-day equivalent of Moscow, as Trump has. And if he does, then, we might have a new kind of a 1972-like paradigm shift. Now, am I predicting that? Not really. But I do think there are ample grounds for it to happen, and it is in China's interest, actually, to make it happen. But I think Xi Jinping's a very conservative man, and I think his vantage point on Trump, not surprisingly, is one of uncertainty. So Trump doesn't evoke a lot of trust. So for Xi to take a risk and dive in with the United States to limit and control and to somehow pressure Pyongyang, North Korea, into giving up their nuclear weapons doesn't seem particularly likely. But I think actually this is one of those areas that we do have common interest. The really only other one is climate change. And, Trump pulled that keystone out of the arch that Obama had so carefully built. So if you go through an assay of those areas where we actually do share something, there are not too many places where we can get together. North Korea, climate change, maybe terrorism, pandemics, things like that. I think, finally, the last thing I want to suggest is watch carefully in the next few days and in the next few weeks to see if the United States does not start in a concerted manner saying to China, listen, the relationship has fallen out of balance. The playing field is not level. We do not have a reciprocal relationship in trade, in education, in whether you can buy media companies in China the way Chinese can buy in America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think you may see some kind of new motion in that direction, and it could change the dynamic of the whole relationship quite considerably if they follow through. As I hear from White House officials, the worm has kind of turned, and they expect that this may come to pass. But it's hard to know because in the Trump administration, nothing is certain.
Orville, thank you.
I'll stop there.
Really appreciate a lot of follow-ups. And again, I encourage you in the room to have your questions ready. I have one that picks up on this notion of common interests, and just to come back to Nixon, who hasn't gotten this much airtime here in a long time. But anyway, he had a habit, I gather. He would have these yellow legal pads of putting down before a negotiation, here's what we want, little list, here's what they want, little list, and then the important thing at the bottom, here's what we both want. And I just jotted down from the China trip, he wrote 3 things. Here's what we both want: reduce danger of confrontation and conflict, a more stable Asia, and to Orville's point just a moment ago, a restraint on the Soviet Union. So what, Orville mentioned North Korea, climate change. What's on the what we both want? What would you write on a legal pad like that right now?
Essentially 3 things. First, we both want to avoid direct conflict or war. Secondly, we both want economic prosperity. And thirdly, there are some specific issues, the final point, like climate change, terrorism. I say climate change. Under Trump, that's not necessarily the case, but generally in America, we want to do something on that. Terrorism, anti-piracy, possible cooperation in parts of the cyber area. So those are the common interests. I think what China wants, they want to dominate Asia in the next 10 years. They want to be the middle kingdom for the world in the next 20 years. They want political stability run by the party. They want economic growth, and they want reunification with Taiwan. So those would be what I think their major goals. And Orville will want to comment on all of this. The U.S., of course, again, you have to distinguish Trump from the U.S. I hope that it's temporary, because right now it's America first and no global leadership. I think the U.S. on the whole, and I think we'll come back to that after we get rid of Trump,
how do you really feel?
What?
How do you really feel?
Well, that's how I really feel. And I've never talked about presidents this way in sessions, including with foreigners. I'm always very respectful, but this man is unique. So I think the U.S. on the whole, again, distinguished from Trump, wants to maintain global leadership. I think would like to get along with China in a cooperative way. It's in our common interest to address these problems and not get into conflict, and to maintain a strong role in Asia, although sharing it with China. So that would be my checklist.
And Orville, you had Winston mentioned your great dispatches. I think there have been 3 already for the China File website. You had a great phrase in one of them, and you've just talked now about wooing and courtship of leaders. So I gather Shinzo Abe made baseball caps that said something about making our alliance greater, that he gave to the president. And then you wrote, quote, "There is a real courtship competition for Donald Trump's affections between Shinzo Abe and Xi Jinping. It will be more than interesting to see whether Xi's courtship of Trump, unfortified by golf," because I guess Xi Jinping is not a golfer, "can reach the same level of ecstasy." So we're talking a little bit about what the U.S. wants and Trump's courtship and all that, but what's Xi's courtship about, and what's he looking for?
Well, I think Xi recognizes that, that the other major power that it has to reckon with somehow, because we're their major trader, we're the most powerful military force in the region, et cetera, is the United States. So he can't just walk away from us any more than we can walk away from him, although our reasons are different. And I think what's so interesting about his relationship to America, and indeed Shinzo Abe's and President Moon's as well, is many European leaders sort of disdained Trump and kept their distance. I mean, Macron had a brief flirtation, but even he was a little bit standoffish. They found him too uncivilized and too blunt, and it just was repellent to them. However, you get out here to Asia, and the thing that is so astounding to me is these 3 countries have really turned it on for Trump. They aren't standing away from him. They're flattering him, they're pandering him, they're catering to his ego, and actually he's doing the same to them. So you have this kind of colossal competition of flattery and sort of trying to win over the other member, and it's a very different dynamic than in Europe. And I think this is an environment in which Trump does very well, because he needs to be flattered. He loves to be flattered, and he knows how to flatter. And so we have a kind of a mutual little pas de deux pandering that goes on in each of the capitals he gets to. Now, will Xi do that? I think he will in his way, his grandeur and awe. You mentioned the ceremony, and he'll really lay it on. But I don't think he's going to actually get to the heart of Trump quite the way Abe did. I think they sort of developing in a curious way a quite close relationship. And even President Moon, his expression, when they did their joint press conference, was very kind of open and warm and receptive. So it'll be very curious to see if Xi's much chillier, more opaque, and sort of aloof posture, particularly towards foreign leaders and Americans, can kind of turn the trick for Trump, win Trump in this way that only he can be won, and this kind of very unique neediness of his that I think Asian leaders are better able to fulfill, at least in Japan and Korea.
Thank you, Orville. And I want to open up to the room now, or questions beyond the room. If you have a question, if you can just let us know who you are, and if you want it directed at either our guest in the room or on the phone. I saw that hand first. If we can pass the microphone there, and then we'll come here.
Hi, my name is Daniel Burke. I work with the Schiller Institute of Helga and Lyndon LaRouche. I have to say I'm somewhat astonished by the attacks on President Trump this morning, but I think that you betray your priorities in that there was no discussion so far of the key item in the CPC 19th Congress, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. President Trump and President Xi both want economic prosperity, as you said. We need high-speed rail built in the United States, where we only have 150 kilometers as compared to 20,000 kilometers in China. Isn't this a central point of harmony, to work together on global infrastructure?
So that's a really good point. We have not mentioned Belt and Road, and there's a lot we haven't mentioned. So I think it's fair to say, even going back to the Obama administration, that the attitude in this country has been defined basically by either skepticism or hostility to it. Is there an opportunity for cooperation? And given Mr. Trump's statements about infrastructure, could that be one of those common interest items?
Well, I agree. It's an important issue. I had 1 minute to talk about the Party Congress, and important as this specific issue is, I think it's less important than the 4 or 5 highlights. But I think the U.S. response to Chinese initiatives the last few years, at least the initial responses, were very ill-advised. I think whether it's the Chinese-led bank, or the Belt and Road, I think the negative attitude and trying to get our allies to stay away was a big mistake. We did some course corrections under Obama, and it's not clear what the current attitude is. I agree that infrastructure is a need. China's trying to fill that need. How successful, it's very ambitious, is not clear to me. But I also agree that we ought to see whether we can cooperate with that. So I take your point on this being a potential area of cooperation. Certainly we need, and again, Trump is failing us by pulling out of the TPP, we need to have a strong economic strategy, including on issues like this in Asia, to go along with the strong military posture that Trump is enunciating.
I should add, just on Belt and Road, and we've had, and I'm sure we'll continue to have, because in terms of economic issues and infrastructure, and not just the U.S.-China relationship, but relationships between China and other countries in the region, it's a giant thing, and people have all sorts of opinions. It isn't just the administration in terms of its viability and which pieces of it are more viable than others. Mimi, did you have a question?
Yes, thanks.
Can we pass the mic down here? And Orville, I just see your lovely face on the screen here, but I can't know when you want to jump in, so don't be shy. Jump in when you like.
Well, one little quick comment about, I think the question raises a very interesting proposition. Why doesn't Trump bring home a big infrastructure collaboration from China, get the One Belt, One Road, go all the way to Detroit? I mean, that would really be an accomplishment and a common interest and build musculature between the two countries. I think it's a kind of a brilliant idea.
I'm going to raise the other elephant in the room. So moving from Belt and Road to another 3-word topic that is, I think, much more controversial. And I'm wondering whether Trump, as he moves from China to Vietnam, will have to deal with this, and that's South China Sea. So I think yesterday we saw that China has unveiled a island boat. That is, it's a boat that can create extra islands just in seconds, as I read. And so I'm just wondering, both from Ambassador Lord and Professor Schell, what your thoughts are in terms of what the Trump administration is likely to do. Of course, this issue has been overshadowed by the North Korean dilemma, but is he likely to make any sort of statements in this trip, and what are we likely to see those statements to be, especially as he moves into Southeast Asia? Thank you very much.
I'll let Orville handle the bulk of this question. Very briefly, you're right to raise this issue. I mentioned briefly it'll be interesting to see when he goes to Southeast Asia how he handles this issue. He cannot avoid it. So far, he has not challenged China or in any rhetoric on this issue. I think they've stepped up freedom of navigation operations. I'm not sure about that. That's what the general convention of wisdom is. They're kept quiet as they should be, but they make an important statement. It should be. So I would hope he would address this issue. It's been rather quiet lately. It's possible that the court decision, which went against China, even though they rejected, has sobered them up a little bit, because there seem to be some quiet negotiations going on bilaterally between China and some of these countries. But I pass it to Orville to give us more perspective.
Well, Winston, I think you're right. It has been somewhat quiescent. But remember that before Trump went to Japan, he stopped in Honolulu and visited the Pacific Command, where Harry Harris is one of the more sort of, more vocal advocates for arching our back in the South China Sea against China's island building and its declarations of vast territories as being its sovereign territory. I think Vietnam, of course, has a major interest in this area too, and that's where the president is going after he leaves Beijing here. So I think we probably should do more freedom of navigation operations where we sail ships through what we believe are international waters, although China contests it. But I think it would be a very good idea if we did this with a Japanese ship, an Australian ship, a ship from New Zealand, from Vietnam, Italy, France. In other words, make it a multilateral effort. And also, don't make it something we do every now and again. Make something that's just regular as clockwork, something that we do as a matter of course because these are international waters. I think those kinds of strategies would be much more effective than occasionally, in a very public and provocative way, sailing a few ships through it, because that is a message of provocation rather than business as usual.
By the way, I fully agree with that. What we do is we sail by contested territories, Vietnam and Philippines and others too, to make it clear that we're underlying international law. So quiet, consistent, no double standards, multilateral. I think I agree with Orville on that.
Have those other countries shown any appetite, though, to doing this? Don't they sort of like it that we take this on?
So far, they haven't. It'd be interesting to see whether, after this trip, whether Japan and Australia step up. By the way, that is a key element we haven't touched on yet. We ought to go to questions, but the careful Tillerson speech before this trip and the Indo-Pacific, not just the Pacific, I think has potentially great significance, and we'll see whether that's spelled out when he gets to APEC and makes a speech there.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions in the room?
I think this is a very fundamental plank, Winston, within the new kind of strategic formulation that's coming out of the National Security Council, and it kind of expands America's sort of pretension of influence all the way to India. And I think it came out of Prime Minister Abe, who is aspiring to a closer alliance with India. And so the fact that the U.S. has adopted it, I think, is giving some deference to him.
Bill?
Bill Rayford. China has built its power and status primarily, certainly significantly, through trade over the last 20, 30, 40 years. What is China's motivation to interfere with freedom of the seas, with free trade, especially in the South China Sea?
Not sure you can hear that, Orville. The question is what is China's motivation to interfere with? Okay. You want to take it?
I'll let Orville go first.
I think that China does have this sort of historical memory of greatness that made it sort of the hegemon of Asia, and it couldn't sort of act out that role for almost a century and a half because of weakness. And now that it's gained wealth and power and is able to act that role out, it is doing that. And I think we see this being made manifest in many other ways, this kind of deep and abiding historical yearning of Chinese to see their country to be truly great again. And that means to act like a great power, throw their weight around like a great power, and even, I'm sorry to say, be a bully from time to time. So I think they look at the South China Sea as kind of their Caribbean. The 9-dash line is sort of their Monroe Doctrine. Of course, it's important to remember that Asia is not like the Caribbean because you have major powers like Japan, Korea, Indonesia, and it isn't just a bunch of little islands with a few yachts.
Yeah, just to add on to that, to get to your point, however, China is totally dependent on trade, and a lot of it goes through that area. So they've been careful to articulate, even as they are very aggressive on territorial claims and militarizing the area, they keep articulating that they're not going to interfere with freedom of navigation. And that's in their own self-interest because of trade, not to have that messed up. However, that gets into details like law of the sea issues about what you can do in 12 miles and 200 miles and so on. We won't get into the weeds here. So at least in principle, China is reflecting your point that they need trade so much they wouldn't mess around with freedom of navigation. But in practice, they're doing things which could threaten it in the future.
Thank you. Rosemary Werrett from Observatory Group. I have a double question. And the first part is one thought out there in the universe is that for Xi to consolidate his power, he must have a military victory to match Mao and to be that big. And so the question out there is, might Trump trade Taiwan for North Korea? Would he kind of waver on the U.S. policy on Taiwan? And then the linked question is, I think it's been said that both China and the U.S. would like to see a denuclearized North Korea, and that's on the shared list. But North Korea has really no interest, from what we can see, in backing off from being a nuclear power. So might the two chiefs of state discuss what would be on North Korea's list that where could it go so that it could back off North Korea and get something from both sides?
So everybody could back off. I didn't get the last part. Back off what?
Back off from its insistence on being a nuclear power.
Oh. Well, what could possibly? It's interesting. Everybody talks about out-of-the-box thinking needed on North Korea. I have never heard. It's a fascinating suggestion. Trade Taiwan for Chinese, support of all the sanctions and blockades and everything with the North.
Well, there's a lot of issues here, and I may leave some out, and Orville will want to comment. First of all, trading Taiwan for North Korea is a horrible idea, and I don't think it'll happen. I think Trump might even be tempted, but the people around him, all our allies, the credibility of America's posture in the world, not to mention the moral and legal dimensions, I think would hem him in, and I don't think even if he had an instinct to do that, I don't think he'll do it. It'll be interesting to see whether in the next 36 hours there is pressure from China on Taiwan, another communique, and so on. Again, I don't think that'll happen. I hope not. On North Korea, I and many others have pushed for sanctions, real sanctions, for 5 or 6 years. People say sanctions haven't worked. Well, they haven't worked because they haven't been tried. They're only close to the Iran-type sanctions, which did work. To his credit, Trump is finally stepping up and being willing to hit some Chinese interests to get their attention. But the sanctions have not been extensive. They've been incremental, and they've been undercut by the Chinese. So to me, we can't get in a long discussion of how to go about North Korea. My own view is, first of all, we ought to talk to the Chinese, and they're reluctant because of the sensitivity of the issue about what unification might look like. That's another word for regime change. But they have legitimate security concerns. And I think we ought to be discussing with them. Maybe we are. I don't think we've had much success. We've done it in think tanks, but not government level, I don't believe. For example, the 82nd Airborne and the PLA wouldn't go in to control nukes. The UN would. If there's a lot of refugees you're worried about, we'll try to steer them towards South Korea, but to the extent they hit China, we'll help you financially on refugees. American troops will go no further north than they are now, and maybe as tensions are reduced, we could withdraw some of them. These are legitimate concerns China has, and it's the reason they've put stability above nuclear weapons as an issue. The reason China's been the problem on North Korea, not the solution. And it's still the problem. I think we're seeing more smoke and mirrors than real, but they are getting tougher because they really are fed up with this guy. It's hurting their interests. We talk about missile defenses and building up American military posture and Indo-Pacific and all the countries getting concerned about North Korea. This is not in China's interest, but I still feel they're more worried about stability, and to the extent we can reassure them with these kinds of talks, the better off we are. Finally, to me, unfortunately, I hate to say this, we're going to have to live de facto, not de jure, with a nuclear North Korea. They're not going to give up their nukes. There's nothing that's going to make them do that. Whether they feel they have to go much further to make their point and have deterrence is not clear yet, but we're not going to be able to negotiate them out of that, no matter what, except unacceptable risks to our alliance and our whole military posture. So my own view is containment, deterrence, and all this tough talk of Trump doesn't bother me. I mean, that's another way of saying deterrence. If people are getting nervous about his rhetoric, well, look at Kim Jong-un's rhetoric. So I don't mind Trump's rhetoric on Korea, and he struck a nice balance in his speech a day ago. So that's deterrence. And then keep up the pressure with sanctions, flood them with information to destabilize them. All the defectors said that's the most important thing. This is not a great option. There are no great options, but it seems to me this kind of pressure, and including hitting Chinese interests, could maybe really force North Korea to rethink certain options. It would slow down their development and would give us a better chance of regime change, which is the only solution in the long run.
So Orville, I mean, Winston has all the good ideas. You're on the trip, and you've had some background briefings. Do you have any insight, not just on what we all think or you think should be done, but what might come up in the conversations? Are there any even small announcements or bargains in the works that you know of on North Korea?
Well, of course, in Japan and Korea, both countries are 100% in agreement that we should do everything we can to pressure the North, and that the best way to do that is to push China. And that doesn't mean that that's going to make Korea give up its nuclear weapons. But I think there are two things that we gain out of it. One, the U.S. and China gain an alliance on a very substantive issue, and it could, in effect, help forge a better relationship between the two countries. And I think it would also make us see clearly whether we exhausted all peaceful options. And then, if we find that North Korea is still obdurate, well, then we may have to go to some harder solutions. I do worry a little, though, that Trump is so obsessed with North Korea, and I think he's right to take it extremely seriously, but that he might just start, I mean, the Chinese are incredibly transactional, and they might just say, okay, what are we going to get back? And then he's got to look through his inventory, and that's when Taiwan comes up. That's when he might say, well, okay, in the South China Sea, we kind of understand, and sort of agree that he wouldn't push them very hard. I mean, that would be difficult. The worst thing would be if he traded any interest of any ally for that. That would be hard. But what could China do? Listen, I see very little talk about there are two major bridges across the Yalu River into North Korea, and that's where all the rail traffic goes. If you close those down, even for a couple of days or a week, just as a demonstration, I think you'd get Kim Jong-un's attention. The only way into North Korea, except for a very occasional flight from Vladivostok in Russia, is through Beijing and Shenyang in Manchuria. You shut those airlines down for a week or two, you would get their attention. And then there's the oil and gas pipeline, there's the banking system, the state trading companies, things like that. So there's no doubt China could do more. And that's going to be the great wager when Trump gets together with Xi, whether they can bring China up another notch in the sanctions.
So we have time for a couple more. Why don't we do this? I'll take these three, but all in one, and we'll try to get, whoever's got a mic closer, it's this woman here, the woman with the pen at the back, and the gentleman right across from me here.
Thank you.
If you can keep it kind of brief. Yeah.
I understand that Trump might see Putin during this trip. What do you, if that is the case, what do you expect from that additional dimension? Thank you.
Trump and Putin. Yes, the woman in the back.
Do we want to answer this?
We're going to go get all three and then see what we can do.
On the North Korea situation, instead of trying to militarily pressure North Korea, when North Korea is claiming that they're developing nuclear weapons program against United States policy of regime change, I don't think it's helpful for United States to have joint military exercise around that area. But instead, right now, what we are seeing is, for example, proposal for the revival of sunshine policy in South Korea with President Moon. And as Dr. Schell just pointed out, gas pipeline proposal, that's already on the negotiation table between Russia, North Korea, and South Korea. Japan is also working with Russia recently very closely on development of Siberia region. China, I think if President Trump, shows his negotiation skill to get the United States collaborating with China on One Belt, One Road, development of Korean Peninsula economically through these policy outlook can be a piece, sort of a solution to this crisis. What do you think about that?
And then the gentleman in the middle.
Hi, my name is Robert Watts with the U.S. Navy. Just curious if there are any lessons to be learned that are relevant to Trump's trip from the recent controversy with the deployment of THAAD to South Korea.
Okay, those are three very different questions. So Trump and Putin, Orville, is it going to happen? And what do we know about what may transpire?
Yes, I think there's going to be a side meeting. I think it's in Da Nang. At least that's what they're reporting. I think, just to jump to the last question because it's fresh in my mind, the lessons from THAAD. Well, you all know what happened when the North started testing missiles and doing nuclear tests. Korea got worried and wanted this thermal high-altitude defense system, THAAD, to come in, quite understandably. The U.S. brought it in, and China went ballistic because they said this is a cabal against them. The radars could be directed against them, and they began to really punish Korea economically. They closed down Lotte stores. Hyundai ran into trouble. They vastly scaled back the number of seats on airlines flying to Korea, which was enjoying a tremendous amount of Chinese tourism. They really pushed them. And then, just before Trump came out here to Asia, miraculously, China yielded. And they made a deal with South Korea that they wouldn't keep persecuting them economically. Korea made a few deals about they wouldn't add additional THAAD batteries, and they wouldn't form an alliance with Japan and the United States against China and a few things like that. But the lesson is that if you're a small country and you're around the Asian neighborhood, you better do what China says or they're going to punish you.
Winston?
Yeah. Well, first on THAAD, I agree with Orville. I thought we were going to disagree, but I think South Korea gave up as much as China did, and I think China's pressures worked. Point you made, no more THAAD batteries to be deployed. Now, someone has pointed out that we don't have any left anyway, so at least for now, I don't know whether that's true or not. No missile defense cooperation with Japan and us, no alliance. These are pretty significant concessions, it seems to me. So I find that THAAD agreement rather disturbing. But it certainly is Orville's main point that South Korea being surrounded historically and now by major powers, they've got to have some insurance policy. Moon has said a balance in the relationship between U.S. and China, which reminds us of previous rather softer South Korean governments. So I think we've got to keep our eye on it. I think the Trump trip probably helps with South Korea and has reassured them, and it's one reason why I think so far so good on this trip. Yeah, the main point of the Putin meeting is North Korea, at least ostensibly. Of course, it's awkward for Trump given what's happening back here on Russia. On the third question, I'm not quite sure what the thrust was, but on military exercises, we have a legitimate right to do that. We have a real threat from North Korea, and South Korea does too. And I would not scale those back. I don't think North Korea is interested in serious negotiations at this point until they firmly establish their deterrent. And once they are a fully declared nuclear power that can reach the Asia Society,
thanks a lot.
I think they may be willing to talk at that point, but keep in mind what their requests are. Now, maybe we can whittle them down, but it's to remove U.S. troops, dissolve the alliance, get rid of the nuclear umbrella, have a peace treaty that does all these things. It's rather extensive. Economic incentives and development of the peninsula, we've tried all that. Successive administrations have offered all kinds of economic incentives, as well as diplomatic relations and security assurances. None of this has worked, and it's not going to work because they're not going to give up the nuclear weapons. So I come back to what I said. I think a military option's out of the question. It's too dangerous, given the threat to Seoul and so on. We're going to have to live, contain, deter, and pressure, and hope we get regime change at some point.
I would agree, and I think that the missing piece of the alliance against North Korea is the wholehearted effort by China. And Russia the question was alluded to, what can Russia do? Well, Russia is the only other country that a little piece of North Korea borders on in the Tumen River area. And there's quite a bit of trade coming in on that corridor. So Russia could actually play a role. I mean, if China was to really ramp up the pressure, I think then if we had a leak in the balloon to Russia, that would be very bad. So, yes, I think we should try, although Trump may have a little trouble with Putin because we all know what's going on back in Washington.
Our hour is up. Before we close, just a reminder that the next iteration of the Asia Briefing, the breakfast session, will be on Tuesday, December the 5th. We'll turn back to the global economy, and the chief economist or chief global strategist, I think he is, Ruchir Sharma with Morgan Stanley, will be here. He always does for us a nice tour, particularly of Asia, of forecasting for the year ahead, and he'll do that on the morning of December the 5th. Encourage you all to keep reading the dispatches that Orville will be filing. I don't know how you do it, Orville, but those are at ChinaFile.com, and then ultimately I guess there'll be a big piece for Vanity Fair. Our thanks to Orville for staying up on little sleep in Beijing. And special thanks again, Winston Lord. As I said, it's just always a pleasure. You've given us so much to chew on, and thank you. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah.